It is easy to assume that a common language would serve as a unifying force for the speakers of that language, one that allows for an ease of communication and the creation of shared cultural and linguistic identities, a unifying force that dissuades conflict and opens the door for mediation and compromise. It is without a doubt an appealing notion. If we can understand each other and communicate any grievances or disagreements we may have with one another, we can pave the path for a compromise. After all, we can understand what the other person is saying without the need for a translator or additional cultural or linguistic context. In reality, however, a common language does not always allow for such mediation, and disunity between peoples that share a language can result in a kind of uncompromising conflict, often worse than between people that do not share one at all. The idea of a nation-state is a relatively recent development in the history of human civilization, a political organization in which a state rules over a population within a territory that is congruent to the borders of a community with a common national identity. This national identity, more often than not, is a common language. In his 1921 book, Language, An Introduction to the Study of Speech, Edward Sapir explored how language goes beyond communication and acts as a powerful marker of social identity, acting like a cultural glue in the forming of national identities. Sapir observed that people do not just use language as a vehicle to convey information, but they also use it to create and sustain a sense of identity. This symbolic function of language became visible to him in the context of national languages. For when a language is designated a national one, it can take on a central role in defining the identity of the whole nation, reflecting the shared values, beliefs, and histories of the nation. These national languages are then often maintained and promoted by government institutions to further solidify language as a source of national unity. In 1881, Eliezer ben Yehuda arrived in the Muda of Jerusalem in modern-day Israel. With the Jewish population of the Muda speaking a variety of different languages from German, Polish, Russian, Spanish, French, Arabic to Yiddish and Ladino, there was very little communication between the Jews of different diasporas. Ben Yehuda believed that the Jews were a nation like any other, and was determined to create a nation-state for his people, one that had been stateless for almost 2,000 years. However, a nation is not a nation without a shared language. He believed that the elevation of one of the foreign languages spoken by the Jews at the time to official status would not only permanently remind his people of their forced exodus, but also place one diasporic community above all others. His solution was to revive the ancient language of Hebrew, one spoken by only a few Jews at the time. Through unending work, Yehuda, his friends, and family were able to refit Hebrew into a language for modern times, codifying the new language in a pocket dictionary for all to learn. By the time of his death in 1922, a language that had been dead for almost 2,000 years was being taught in schools and spoken in homes all throughout the Mandate of Palestine. 2 decades after his death, Hebrew had become the language of government, business, and industry throughout the newly declared State of Israel. In the interrogative function of language, do we need a national language to unite us? Theodoro I. Lesmon asserts that because of the efforts of Yehuda, the Jews were, quote, one people speaking one language. In Language Unification, Labor, and Ideology, Yang Yu examines the effect of the Chinese Pinyin Act, which aimed to standardize Mandarin as China's national language. Throughout time immemorial, China was a state of many peoples and many ethnicities, enduring long periods of unity and disunity. After the last successful unification of China under Mao Zedong in 1949, a process of standardization and assimilation began all throughout the minority regions of the state. The Chinese Pinyin Act, beginning in 1958, was successful in teaching standard Mandarin to millions from the plateaus of southern China to the Mongolian steppe. The reform strengthened national unity and patriotism, as the newly common language fostered a sense of unity and trust within the nation. Exposure to standard Mandarin throughout media outlets amplified government influence over ideological views, reducing enthusiasm for Western-style democracy and increasing support for government intervention over free market liberalism, helping the populace to align closer to the ideology of the Communist Party and encouraging public support for socialism and public ownership. Standard Mandarin proficiency correlated with an ideological alignment of the people to that of the Communist parties and discouraged anti-government, ethnic sedition, and affiliation with non-Han organizations. This shift towards Standard Mandarin promoted a unity under the party in which minorities were assimilated and further political and ethnic homogeneity was achieved. If a common language is a strong source of national unity, would it be then true that countries containing a diversity of languages are less united and more prone to internal conflict? Ibrahim Abadawil and Nicholas Sambanis, in their study Why Are There So Many Civil Wars in Africa? Understanding and Preventing Violent Conflict, argues that it is not ethno-linguistic diversity that leads to conflict. They argue that although African countries have some of the highest levels of ethno-linguistic diversity in the world, their high level of internal conflicts and civil wars are not due to this diversity, but rather economic and political factors. Ethnic diversity in Africa, contrary to common belief, may actually reduce the risk of conflict. The authors argue that ethnic diversity requires intergroup cooperation, a positive force in any society, and cases of extreme ethnic polarization, in which one group dominates others, is far more likely to end in violence than diversity itself. In highly diverse societies, like those found in Africa, with numerous ethnic groups, it can be challenging for any single group to gain dominance, making a large-scale conflict less likely. In Chapter 8 of the book, The Roots of Ethnic Conflicts in Africa, The Myth of Language as a Unifying Factor, Conflict in Monolingual Rwanda and Somalia, Tom Odinti-Louche argues that a common language does not necessarily create unity. He raises the example of monolingual Rwanda, a country that experienced one of the most brutal genocides in history. Both the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda speak the same Bantu language of Rwanda, Rundi, with historians believing that the Hutu and the Tutsi share common roots dating back 1,000 years. Despite this shared history and language, over the course of 100 days in the summer of 1994, Hutu militias systematically murdered upwards of 700,000 Tutsis, revenge for the Tutsis' minority rule over Rwanda. In rural areas where Tutsi and Hutu families had lived side by side, it was easy for Hutu to identify and target their Tutsi neighbors, killing people they had known their entire lives. By the end of the genocide, hundreds of thousands were dead. Thousands of women, many of whom were subjected to rape, became HIV positive. Around 400,000 children became orphans, and an estimated 2 million Rwandans were displaced and became refugees. Luce believes that a common language serves as an expression of collective identities, and that a solidarity of common language fosters depends on the external factors, such as shared values, rather than being the origin of such solidarity. To him, a common language alone contributes little to unity. Edward Sapir, Theodoro A. Lesmond, and Yang Yu believe that the establishment and perpetuation of a common language leads to national unity. Sapir believes that a national language takes on a central role in defining a nation's identity, while Lamzon credits the revival of Hebrew by Yehuda with the laying of the foundations for a united Jewish state. Yu attributes greater social cohesion in China to the implementation of the Chinese Pinyin Act. However, others, like Ibrahim Abawaldi and Nicholas Sambinis, argue that the absence of a common language does not necessarily cause disunity, while Tom Odinti-Louche goes further and believes that a common language alone does little for national unity. During the 20th century, over 100 million people were murdered by their own governments. More people died at the hands of their own governments than by all wars combined. In the 1940s, Germans and Jews shared more than just a language. They shared centuries of intertwined history, cultural customs, and to an extent, a sense of hyphenated German identity. This cultural and linguistic commonality, however, was not enough to prevent the rise of National Socialism. The Nazi Party needed to create a scapegoat for the ailments of interwar Germany, and so created an other out of a similar group. Nazi officials had to rely on identification papers, not physical differences, to single out Jews, revealing just how arbitrary and constructed this otherness was. The worst crime in human history, the Holocaust, the industrialization of mass murder, was committed by a people that shared the same language to those that they killed. During the breakup of Yugoslavia, Slovenia and Macedonia, the two republics linguistically distinct from the Serbo-Croatian speaking majority, were able to leave with little conflict. But Bosnia and Croatia, republics that shared a language, a history, and similar cultures with Belgrade, became embroiled in some of the most vicious conflicts in modern history. The devastating violence committed in the name of preserving a nation-state is something we see too often. It is clear that a common language can without a doubt provide a great source of unity between people. However, it seems that when disunity arises within a group of people that share a language, the resulting conflict is as brutal, if not more brutal, than conflicts between groups of people that do not share one at all. It seems that when people share so much in common, they are able to find subtle distinctions to set themselves apart. In Germany, Bosnia, Croatia, and Rwanda, the narcissism of small differences played out large, with devastating consequences.